All right, before we move on to the essays in part two here, let me just walk you through some different interpretations of the ending. Great art is oftentimes open to interpretation. It asks a question, it doesn't always answer it, which can be infuriating, but also mysterious and motivating, I suppose. Here's a few different interpretations that I came up with, and you can see number four I jotted down. What's yours? But here's kind of where the poem ends, I think, anyway. Um, One, we could read this as the Bible could empower the African American community, the slave community, through its stories, if only they could read it. This would help them reconcile the crazy feeling that they get from the sky at the end. This sort of irrational, crazy feeling could be turned into a knowable thing, a knowledge, an idea, or a right, or something about the dignity of their humanness, right? Maybe we could connect to social justice in terms of sustainability, equality, at least on the spiritual level, if not on the actual social level, and they're still slaves, right? So the Bible could empower them if only they could read it. Why? Because, well, this is what our course is about. Words help us interpret and define and make sense of the world. We have only the language we use to define things. There kind of is no thing itself in that way, right? Only our social uses. Number two, kind of the same as above, right? The Bible could empower them if only they could read it. But the author is being pessimistic or ironic here. The book and reading wouldn't help them interpret their lives or environment much at all, because why? The master is in charge of reading, right? Of literacy and its powers. So literacy is a tool of power here to literally enslave people, right? White people are in charge of the Bible as well as Greek myth and what it all means, and if you can even read. And so we can read it that way too, that there's, it's a bit pessimistic at the ending and there's not as much hope as they wish. That's the crazy feeling, the wish to liberate oneself, but they're kind of trapped in the social system that won't let them read the Bible, right? And find those meanings. A more positive twist in number two could be the Bible offers multiple interpretations of dignity and humanity and power and race. If they could read, they could find the ones that represent their humanity and their view of what, proper social arrangements or social justice would be. But they're kind of trapped in the ones that society used in the 19th century, which justified slavery, right? And so you could look at it that way too, which is slightly different than number one, but very similar to it. Next, let's talk about Gloria Anzaldua's El Retorno. We can talk about the essay in its own right and what's it saying, but I think to give this a good reading and pull a lot of interesting stuff out of it, we can connect it to sustainability, both with the resources. We see a lot of used up technology here, the cars that are there and all of these types of things. Cars that have flowers in the trunks by the end, right? So we can see some sense of sustainability or repurposing things. And definitions of the natural. One of the big questions I asked you is, how does this writer avoid the negative stereotypes of her people being labeled natural or closer to nature? Usually that works against people, as we know from the first sustainability module, the 2.1 module. And she seems to avoid that most likely. So what do we have here to justify my reading? We'll flip down to my big takeaway in a minute. I just kind of went through paragraph by paragraph and noted some things, and you can take a bigger look through these. But nature is kind of a cycle right from the beginning. It kind of comes in the form of like the snake or the serpent, which is part mythology and partly what the geography looks like. So we're getting a mix here, a blend of the spiritual and the environmental in some way, right? It's circular. It's compared to an animal spirits, which are fairly common in sort of a shamanistic type of culture, which we could say this is. Paragraph 2, if you take a look at it, she's in a landscape where she's potentially food, right? This is sort of survival. So if we're giving an ecological reading of this, all bets are off on people being larger than animals or the environment, right? This could be seen as, if not a dangerous place, at least sort of a barren place where the rules of modern society don't apply so much, right? It's on the borderlands, so to speak. Notice that the traffic, which represents civilization early on, moves like an irritated sow, another animal reference. We're being drawn in to sort of ecological or animal references here in the way just the piece feels, right? And there's a lot of that going on here. So we're beginning a viewpoint of the world through nature, and nature defined not the way that science defines it, but the way that non-white cultures and their spirituality has defined it, right? Through animal metaphor and metaphors based upon the real world. Here's one thing we might kind of say about paragraph 3. Her home, her people are sort of in between two worlds, right? There's agriculture happening, animal fencing on the shrubs, right? So it's not It's not a modern farm by any means, but it's subsistence farming, and they're doing this. They're doing agriculture, but yet at the same time, there's broken cars in the yard, and she's very self-conscious about that too. She says the whole culture is. They know they haven't achieved being modern, right? They're very aware of that, and she's aware of that. She's trying to find and recover the good in all of that. One thing I'd like you to see is that there's broken cars in the yard. This is, technology and progress, but it's broken down and doesn't work for this culture. Remember what this culture does by the end, and this gets into sustainability of resources, but also spiritual sustainability. They take all this broken technology of the modern world, of American culture, their latest colonizer, and she talks about how many colonizers have had, but American culture is their latest colonizer, and they repurpose it. They're planting plants, right, and flowers inside of the trunks of these broken cars. And so this is a culture, if we want to go to the end now, to kind of get the big takeaways, to make sure we get there. This is a culture that places back into its own cultural systems. That could be the spiritual, the economic, how they function on the landscape. But they put back the waste from all these other cultures into their own system, right? So it is cyclical, if we think of it that way. The cultural sustainability, you've got sustenance farming, but everything that they do in here that Western societies or all the invaders that came in, all those invaders left, and the things that they left behind, whether it was their religion and Christianity as mentioned in here, or whether it's the broken down cars or the highway in the distance, it all gets repurposed in some ways. Right? We can look here too as well at the TV shows. This is really interesting. There's the junk cars, right? The TV shows that are half in Spanish and half in English, they're halfway in between. They're halfway in between two cultures. The thing about this is that it's a focus on language again. Language defines culture. It defines our way of seeing the world. And they can't quite see the world in the modern sense, and they can't quite join it either. They're still cast back into their own culture. And she's actually recovering that and saying that's not bad necessarily. It'd be easy to look at what they have if you're driving by on the highway and say, oh my gosh, look at the way those people live. Right? That's absolutely awful. Why don't those people join the modern world? And maybe they can't. Maybe they're locked out. Maybe they don't want to, but they found their own sense of how life is sustainable here, even though it's a desolate landscape. So she's taking basically the stuff of pop culture and showing how they're in between the two cultures, and eventually when they don't really want to join in many ways. She says there's a lot of despair there. This is really, really interesting, where we learn about the educational system. If we want to go back to my notes a bit here, the educational system that sort of, was angry at them just for being Mexican, even though what else could they be, right? And the white teachers were racist, right? Get through a bit. Here's the bit on education and how American or Western institutions, such as education, can harbor some racism. They show up in these places and want to modernize people through education. It's one way to modernize people. And make things culturally sustainable, right? Yet along with that comes inequality. There's our social justice, or the lack of it in this case, right? We then get how this has been a repeated pattern on this culture, all the different conquerors that have come through over the years and the different things that they've been, and they've had to sort of pick up the waste of these cultures, so to speak, and try to make their own culture out of it, right? We also then get a really brief foray into economics in one paragraph. And what we see right here isn't so different than what we learned and what I talked about in the past and what we'll see in future readings when we look at Coca-Cola in Mexico and the way that Coca-Cola takes the water of towns and destroys potential irrigation and sanitation and clean drinking water and just creates water shortages. Here, it's again based in a global economy, but we can see that the global economy always favors the stronger country, in this case, the United States. The goods were too expensive for Mexicans to buy, and their Mexican goods that they made became really, really cheap over time and didn't give them any money back into their own economic system back in Mexico. So these people remain poor because of that. The global economy has failed them in some way. So this is the economy, of course, is connected to culture, right? Different cultures have different economies. So even this aspect, the economic aspect, has failed them, and they've got to try to make sense of it, right? We get almost a completely different theme, the effect on their health to some degree, right? The average age at 56, which is really young, as we all know, and her dad only lived to be 38. She says he worked himself to death. We know that nothing grows here, so there's the link to the environment and sustainability, right? These are people that are living in a place that's almost unfarmable right? Yet they have no other choice. This is where they've been put, right? And it's hard for them to leave because of some of the institutional racism against them. And also, of course, because they may not want to leave. This is still home, as different as it seems from the way that many people live in the modern world. And in the end, then, where I think I just like to finish this is again reminding you that this is a culture that takes everything that the modern, so-called modern world has given it, its technology and progress and political systems, educational systems, economic systems, and it's had to remake them into whatever it can to try to survive, right, and create its own culture. And so you can see a few more notes on that here. One thing I might add real quick, most of the readings so far have sort of been towards social justice and sustainability, that end of it. But we might see just in terms of resources, land, water, agriculture, etc., we could look at it this way. As I mentioned, all the goods of modern technology, the cars and all these type of things have repurposed. The land is bad for farming. The markets are bad for the people. It favors Americans. So if we look at resources, the agricultural and economic systems that sort of run agriculture aren't sustainable, at least for this group of people, right? Why? Because the systems favor American interests and not their own. So we do see some commentary on resource use here as well, and not just social justice. All right, let's talk about Annie Dillard's Deer at Providencia. One theme in Dillard's work, and you see it here, is that nature's competitiveness is sometimes shocking to humans. Her famous book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, also covers this. She's looking at this beautiful nature scene and then something gets eaten right in front of her, right? So this is going beyond appreciation. It's actually in some ways a commentary on how our appreciation of nature as Americans, especially, is burst when we see pain and suffering that comes naturally from the ecosystem. In some ways, what this is about is that as Americans, we're so distant from all of this that we can actually tune in to the pain and suffering, and our culture sees it as pain and suffering rather than sort of the natural course of life. And you can see that a lot of the other cultures represented in here didn't feel so bad about the deer. And she winds up eating a deer just like it that was caught the day before, right? And she said, well, this is pretty good. It's good food. So she seems to be getting out of her culture and realizing that American culture has the privilege of seeing suffering and pain in animals because we're so distant as Americans from our food supply. We don't have to hunt and be, in competition with these animals for survival or whatever it might be. But in the Ecuadorian jungle, things are very different. So that's one thing that we can see in here. In terms of culture, something we can see is that she says pobrecito at the end, right? But she says, I didn't really mean it. I was just trying out language. So she's also, there's a hint of other cultures are closer to the ecosystem, and she's kind of trying this out. She's trying it out through their language. Language is, again, culture and control or ways of seeing the world. And she's moving beyond the American way of seeing things. And perhaps towards something else, right? We know this for other reasons that I'm sure you picked up on. She's the only American woman. It seems like everybody's waiting for her to be the weak one and want to save the deer. The others less so, even the American men. One American man says, my wife would definitely let it go. So this is a story sort of about American weakness, or if weakness isn't the right word, the way that we have the privilege of seeing the world as in terms of pain and suffering because we're distant from the ecosystem. But then there's this one other interesting thing that happens at the end, the burn victim story. And what does that mean? Clearly it's parallel to the deer. The deer even gets snared in the net twice and the burn victim gets burned twice, right? But is she bothered by the deer? Not really. She's sort of learning about this culture and being close to the ecosystem, right? Is she bothered by the burn victim? Maybe. It's hard to tell, right? This is another great piece of art that doesn't give us answers or a specific interpretation. She as a person seems to be searching for answers, right? The deer and the burn victim are similar, but they have very different roles, right? The human is trapped or hurt by modern technology in the world, gas and gunpowder, and it seems unfair in some ways, right? And the deer is trapped by the village dogs, which is a lot more natural. And the deer becomes eaten and is part of the ecosystem. She might be saying our ecosystem seems to do nothing, this modern ecosystem of technology, but potentially have hazards and accidents that can hurt us, and leaves us wondering, well, what's the point of life? Why did I get hurt? Because it's not attached to nature and the ecosystem and the way that the world works naturally. We've created sort of this human-made thing, and we have all these unanswered questions about justice when this happens. Our human creations create more questions than answers.